Well, if you have a Bible or an app that has that sort of thing, we're going to be in Acts 17 today. And the goal today is we're going to look at how the church engages culture. So the story we're going to read is when Paul is in one of the biggest cities of his time, Athens. He's on his second missionary journey. He's actually waiting for some friends. He had no plan to actually be in this town. And this is what happens when he finds himself there. I'm going to start reading in verse 22. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with an inscription to the unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he gives gifts to everyone, life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole world. And he marked out their appointed times in history on the boundaries of the lands. God did this so they would seek him and perhaps even reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and we move and we have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being, like gold or silver or stone, an image made in human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he set a day where he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." And then I want to read just briefly from 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about the mindset we have to have as we engage culture, where it says, "Though I am free and I belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone, as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but under Christ's law. So it is to win those not having a law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that at all possible means I may save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share in its blessings." And that's God's word, and it's God commanding us to reach the world around us. And if you think about it, we all talk about culture. Do you know what culture really is? And it's tough to define it, because asking someone in a culture what culture is like asking a fish what water is. They might not even be aware that they're in water. It's just how they live. And culture is what we have here, where it's a shared set of principles, it's ideas, it's things that keep us together. It's knowing what eye contact looks like, what a head nod, what a hand signal, what line to stand in, all the little cultural cues that we pick up around us. And what's interesting is right now, our culture is changing. I'm not sure if you've noticed that, but if you just watch the news or read the papers, or if you've attended university, you can see that things are changing very quickly, and we're beginning to disagree on basic things. And so we're in a series right now talking about what the church is called to do. In the first week, we said the church has good news. We believe that Jesus died on the cross. He's here to save everybody. That there's bad news. You're a sinner that needs to be saved. You needed Jesus to die for you. There's good news that he did die for you. He loves you that much. That's the good news. Last week, we said that the church is called to be compassionate. That we're actually called to be slaves, servants to society. That we take the worst parts, like Jesus washing the disciples' feet, to show what love looks like. We don't just stay here and say, hey, we love the world. We should get out of the church and love people. But the people who need to hear the good news, the people who need to experience compassion, are people who live in a culture. And so we have to understand their culture if we're ever going to reach them. Because if we have our own little silo and we're over there, we can do things that we think are loving and say things that are loving, and it doesn't connect at all. You ever done that where you meant such good things, and by the end of it, just because of cultural gaps, you had no idea what the other person was talking about, you actually did damage? When I was a kid, I lived in South Holland, Illinois, which is about as Dutch as Linden was back then, or is back then. So mostly white, mostly Dutch. There was a couple Polish people on our block, and they seemed weird because they were just still European, but just a different part of Europe. That was how small my bubble was. And I was about maybe third grade, and a family moved in next door, the Mazafars. And the boy next door was a year younger than me. His name was Omar Mohammed Mazafar. But I had no mental grid for what an Omar was. And so for about a month, I called him Elmer. And I want to meet my friend Elmer, and me and Elmer were best friends. We played, I broke his swing set, it was great. And then finally, Mr. Mazafar pulled my dad aside and says, your son says my son's name with an accent or something. It sounds like he's saying Elmer. This is him being very tactful. It's actually Omar. And I had to learn a whole new part of my brain. You know how synapses work? A whole part of my brain had to refire and correct that because I just had no cultural understanding of anything. They went on pilgrimage to, I forget where, in Saudi Arabia, Mecca, and came back with holy water, and like, would you like some holy water? I loved God. I went to church, like 4 times a week. So I'm like, yeah, anything holy. So they gave this to me. I drank this water. I think it's from the Ganges River or one of those. I got dysentery. It was great. You can do a whole sermon about that stuff. But my point is, our different cultures, even though we all wanted to love each other, even though we all wanted to live, we're just next door to each other. We had very different cultures. They would have people over every week to play bridge. They made curry. They didn't understand why their house didn't sell right away because it just smelled of their very different sort of cooking than we had on the rest of the block. And all those little cultural things, none of them were wrong. The way they ate, the way they had people over for bridge. But they were different. And so understanding culture is often understanding things that are different. There are rights and wrongs, and we can get into that. But a lot of it is, how do I understand where you're coming from so that I can communicate the gospel to you so I can actually love you? So today we're going to look at 3 ways of engaging culture. I guess you can't really see that, but hopefully you can. The first one is to look at the idols in every culture, and every culture has them. Then we're going to learn how to develop a strategy. But the most place where we're going to spend our time today is, how do we have conversations? How do we step into conversations? I think that's what we're called to do. I think we're called to stand on street corners with bullhorns and signs and say, repent, turn or burn. I think we're called to step into places where we actually talk to people who believe things differently than us. So first, let's look at the culture's idols. When Paul went to Athens, Athens was in like the late afternoon of their glory. If you've ever heard of Athens, you probably have if you took any like literature classes. This is where Aristotle and Plato and Homer and all those people, not Homer Simpson, the Greek playwright Homer, they all lived in Athens. And Athens became great right after the Persian Empire. If you ever saw 300, there was the big battle of Thermopylae where 300 Spartans fought them all off. And after that, Greece had a time of peace. And that ushered in the golden age of Athens. They had great literature with the Odyssey, the Iliad were written. Philosophy happened. You had Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Art was developed there. But this was about 500-600 years before Paul. So when Paul got there, things were getting a little dingy. And as he visited, he was on a holding pattern, waiting for the next part of his missionary journey. It says right before the passage we read that when Paul was waiting in the city of Athens, he was greatly distressed because he saw the world was full of idols. The city was full of idols. And when it says full of idols, it means idols were everywhere. You ever been to Waffle House, how they have the smothered covered hash browns? That's how idolatry was there. It was just everywhere. Or the way they serve broccoli in the Midwest with hollandaise sauce and cheddar cheese. It just is, it's more sauce than broccoli. It's kind of not the only way I eat broccoli. There's a lot of cheese on it. And that's the way idolatry was. Everywhere they went, there was idolatry. In the middle of the city was the Parthenon. There was a statue of Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. And the glittering point of her spear could be seen 40 miles away. And what's said in the passage we read is that there was even a shrine to an unknown god. And the legend is that there was a giant plague in Athens, and they sacrificed to every god, and the plague kept happening, so they thought, we must have missed somebody. So they took a sacrificial sheep, and they set it free, and they just followed it around until it died. And when it died, they sacrificed it, and then they built an altar saying, we don't know what God this is, but this is the God that brought this plague, so we're just going to be careful, and we're going to say, whatever you are, whoever you are, we're sorry for whatever we did. And they built the shrine to an unknown God. And it's actually documented outside the Bible that this exists. And what Paul was distressed by was first that there was idols everywhere. He saw the Parthenon, he saw these altars, there was Zeus, a bunch of other things. But he saw that even deeper than that, if we're honest about idolatry, it's even under the politics. It's under the culture. It's under your business ventures. That idolatry gets into everywhere. If you ever studied Greek mythology, you know all the different gods. There was Artemis, who was the god of prosperity, so people would worship Artemis if they wanted to get rich. She started off the goddess of the moon and of the hunt, and they sort of took that like the way that she pursued deer, we're going to pursue money and gain. In a different part of the book of Acts, they go to another city, I think Ephesus, and there's a giant cult of Artemis. And when Paul starts preaching the gospel, they start losing money and cause riots. We already mentioned Athena. She's the goddess of wisdom and of politics. There was Nike. She was the goddess of victory, worshipped by athletes. People like Michael Jordan worship Nike. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and fertility. Apollo, the god of sun and poetry. Dionysius, the god of frat parties. Also, Bacchus is another name for him in Latin. That's what they worshiped then. And aren't you glad that we've progressed to such a place where we no longer have idols like that? That we no longer worship money and politics and sex and parties and athletics? Or have we progressed? There's a Catholic theologian who lived in England, G.K. Chesterton, and he said that when man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing. He'll believe in anything. And so if you look at the world today, it's just as filled with idols. We're just better at hiding it. I mean, go back through that Greek list. Artemis, money, power. Do we believe in that? Have you ever met anybody who dedicates their whole life to that? Remember that old cradle, Cats in the Cradle and the Silver Spoon? Pretty much the story. I just got censored by God. That's pretty much the story of a man who was worshiping idols, worshiping the idol of money. And so much that he couldn't worship the idol of his son. He was saying the man cannot both serve God and his family. And the story of Cats in the Cradle is I chose to serve the man in the song. I served money, and I lost my kid. Idolatry. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and politics. Do you know anybody who thinks that if we can get our politics right, the world will be saved? That if my candidate gets elected or doesn't lose the election or doesn't get false news or whatever you believe politically, if this happens in my worldview, then things will be great because it's God and whatever political party. Nike, do you know anybody who lives their whole life victory? Whether it's athletics or they weren't a good athlete, so they live vicariously through their kids' athletics, or they get older and they start playing rugby so that they can prove that there's something. That was my story. Aphrodite, people who just live for sex or to look good. We can keep going down the list. The idols that were in Greece are the idols that are in us. And so this is where I find the Bible is so wise. One of the biggest idols I see in the world today is escape. People just want to tune out from the world and get away from it. The CEO of Netflix says our only real competition right now is sleep. If we get people to sleep a little bit less, they'll watch us a little bit more. We have every other part of their free time because they just want to unplug. During COVID, people hit the bottle hard because they wanted to escape. They were home, they're bored, anxious. So what do? Nielsen reported that there's a 54% increase in national sales of alcohol over the last year. And this isn't about alcohol being bad. It's just saying that there's something in us, an idolatry or a lack of idolatry, where we want to have something to fill our hearts. And when it doesn't, we turn on the television, we pick up the bottle, we look for the next girl or guy, we try to find the next paycheck, we check our bank account, we invest in cryptocurrency. Whatever it is, all those little things try to fill these gaps in our hearts. And that's what idolatry is. And Paul saw this and he was distressed. He wasn't indignant like, man, you guys are dumb. He was distressed so much that he went to talk to people. And I hope that we can have that attitude, that when we see the idols in our world, we don't just shake our head and say, you know what? They're so dumb. It's tempting. Every time I see a protest on TV, I just think about how foolish it is. But really, they're chasing something. They have a goal of whether it's equality or indignation, whatever their goal is, and they're pursuing it in a way I never would. But could I understand what they're trying to accomplish? What's their heart's objective? Or even someone on a different political spectrum from you, can you understand what's driving them? They may never call it an idol. Most people today don't. But what's that goal? Why are you so mad at so-and-so? What's behind that? Ask some questions. Help people understand. Maybe they don't even know. There's many times I'm like, I don't know. I'm just mad. The world is awful. Well, what's really going on that? It can take some time to get underneath that. So that's really the first thing we have to do is look at where are the idols in our world. That's what Paul did. And then have our hearts broken so that we decide to step into it. And that's the next thing, is to develop a strategy. It says in verse 17, so Paul, after seeing how distressed everyone was, he reasoned with them in the synagogue. So he talked to Jews and Greeks and God-fearing Greeks, as well in the marketplace from day to day with those who happened to be there. So Paul's normal strategy was he'd go to the synagogue, which was Jewish church, more or less, and he would talk about Jesus, and then they would usually kick him out and sometimes try to kill him. And then he would go to the marketplace and talk there. And then occasionally he'd go to bigger forums. And that's what happens here in Athens. He shows up where his people are. He goes to synagogue. And back then, if you were a visiting rabbi, they would have you stand up and give us talk. And so when it was his turn, he stood up and said, listen, this is who Jesus is. And they drove him out, so he goes to the marketplace. In other words, he's out of church now talking to people just wherever people are. He's at Starbucks or Pike Place Market or school. And he's talking to people who are interested in him. He finds some Epicureans, some Stoics who decide to be interested. They get into a fight. They say, what is this babbler talking about? And then they drag him to a place called the Areopagus. I could say it all. Now that I'm in front of you, I can't. Areopagus, which is Mars Hill. So if you had right across from the Parthenon, which was to Athena, there was a shrine to the god Ares. If you saw the first Wonder Woman, that was the bad guy, Ares, also called Mars in Roman. And he had a shrine there, and that's where all the philosophers would get up, and they would talk for hours. You think this sermon is long. They would talk for probably 2 to 3 hours on average. They would have these monologues. And so they invite Paul to go there. And he gets a chance in front of the best minds in Athens, and he begins to talk about Jesus and the resurrection. And again, what I read was just the cliff notes of what he talked about, but we're going to get into that in the next step. But I just want to ask you, do you have a strategy to actually talk to people about God? What Paul did is he went from the synagogue to the marketplace to sometimes he gets a bigger venture. And I think that has to be our strategy. First, we need to talk about God here. And it sounds like you're preaching to the choir, but my philosophy is there's always people in church on a Sunday who don't follow Jesus. There's always people listening in who have deep questions about their faith, or they follow Jesus for a time and they're going through a time of struggle right now. So what I try to do is address some of the questions that people may have, anticipate their objections and overcome them. I don't always do it well, but that's our goal. And so even in this room, we need to make sure that we're preaching the gospel to each other, because sometimes even people in the church get discouraged. And sometimes we need to be reminded that we're forgiven and loved. And also sometimes we invite friends who desperately need to hear the gospel. And so we're always sharing it here. But it can't just stay here. And this is what the church I grew up in, as I was a kid, they've gotten better since then. Oddly, since I left, they got a lot better. I don't know how that works. But we need to get the gospel out of this building and into the streets. So if you have a job, how do you take it to your job? If you're a member of a gym, how do you take the gospel to the gym? If you go to a coffee shop, how do you bring the gospel there? And it's not going to the gym, putting on your "Do You Even Lift Bro" shirt with Jesus pressing the cross. Everyone ever had that, the Lord's Gym shirt? Back in the 80s, I had this. It looked like the Gold's Gym logo, but it was Jesus instead of a gorilla, and he was bench pressing a cross. It was awful. Don't do that. But instead, when you're at the gym and someone's looking for the same piece of equipment as you, you're like, yeah, you go first. And you don't get upset about it. You keep your earphones off so you have opportunity to talk to somebody. Or at least one, and what I usually do is like one earphone in, so I'm kind of half tuned into you and half tuned into my own world. Not perfect, but just being honest. And you look around like, who can I actually talk to? It's amazing. A lot of people between sets don't want to talk, and their bodies tell you that, or sometimes they do want to talk because they're exhausted, or they're only at the gym because they feel like they need to be. But wherever you go, you can bring Jesus with you in all those little things. There's that old phrase, preach Christ at all times, when necessary, use words. At some point, you're going to need to use words. But at work, in school, at home, wherever you go, you can do a lot of little things to help people see what Jesus is like. And then occasionally, you may find yourself on a Mars Hill situation where you get a bigger platform. where suddenly you see that there's a whole group of people who are suddenly listening. And that's when you pray. What Paul did was he would always pray and kind of read the room, and none of his sermons are the same. Whenever Paul gets in front of people, he's always looking, okay, what are you listening to? What are your questions? What are your idols? And now I'm going to present the gospel so that you can actually hear it. And that's our next step, really, is to have those conversations. And so this is a 3-point sermon, but I have 4 points under this 1 point, just to disappoint you. These are the 4 ways you have a conversation, or at least the big brushes in this context. First is just listen to the questions people are asking, and we'll unpack all these. Next is find places of agreement, uncover gaps in their worldview, and then share the gospel. So listen to the questions people are asking, and that can be big. What are people actually asking? What are their questions? What are their idols trying to uncover? In Greek philosophy, when Paul stepped into Athens, he was an educated man. He went to university of his time, and so he was aware of a lot of what was going on there. And Greek philosophy back then was plagued by a big question. How does the world make sense? Is there any bigger question? And to break it down, what they decided is, how is there so much diversity in the world? There's different genders, different cultures, different animals, different sorts of food, but everything works together. So the way they phrased it is, how do you have unity and diversity? Which is why we live in a thing that they coined the term universe. Unity and diversity. You go to school to study in a university, the place where you study the unity within the diversity. What is the unity underneath all the change? That's what that drove them to madness, to question, to philosophy, to science. Carl Sagan, on the first page of the book Cosmos, asks the same question. He says that science is searching for a reason why the cosmos is not chaos. If all we had were senses and stuff, the world would make no sense, but somehow it makes sense. Why? So this is the question that Greeks were asking, and a guy, the picture, probably the kind of representation of a bunch of statues of him, is a guy named Thales. He was the father of Greek philosophy and mathematics, and he decided that the thing that united everything was water. Now, it wasn't right, but you can see why he might have thought that back then, because water can be liquid, it can be solid, it can be gas, and we're made up mostly of water. So he thought, okay, if underneath everything is water, but now I still have some questions, because some stuff moves all by itself. I've never seen a rock throw itself, but I've seen a person walk. Where does motion come from? Where are some things alive and other things aren't alive? And so even though he came up with a unifying element and was close-ish for his understanding, there was deeper questions. Where do we have our actual being? Where do we learn how to move? We know that back then even, objects at rest tend to stay at rest. Objects in motions tend to stay in motion. Why do things move? And that's still a problem for us. Jumping back to Carl Sagan, R.C. Sproul had a conversation with him. And he said, okay, before the Big Bang Theory, everything was solid and inert and stable. Everything in the universe, they speculate, was compressed into a micro singularity. And it stayed there for what seemed to be eternity. And then in one moment, like a Tuesday afternoon at 11:30, the universe decided to stop being inert and start expanding. And so R.C. Sproul asked Carl Sagan, how do you account for the change from that eternal state? And Carl Sagan writes, or answered, but I don't really want to go there. I don't think we can go further back than the billionth of a microsecond before the Big Bang. And before that, it's a mystery. And Sproul's comeback was, you're a scientist, you have to ask why. You can't just say, okay, there was a Big Bang, and then before that, we don't know. You haven't moved an inch since Thales in 500 BC. We have better theories. It's not water, dark matter, and neutrons and protons. There's still so much we don't understand. And so philosophy has been asking these questions for a long time. And they understood that change happens. A guy named Heraclitus says you can't step into the same river twice because it keeps moving. Change happens, but why does it happen? And what started it all? And then later you get people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and they were in that order. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and he taught us all how to have war. But Plato, all of them understood that you have to have something that unites everything. And so Aristotle came up with something called an ultimate cause, an unmoved mover. And that's as close as they could get. If there is a God, he's an unmoved mover. And in our passage, I'm almost done with your Greek lesson, by the way. This all ties back, because Paul actually talks to people called the Stoics and the Epicureans. And they were their philosophical grandkids. Because Aristotle and them couldn't answer the ultimate questions, they decided, well, how do we actually get together to live in life? So they would wonder just how can we have fun? How can we get through life without it hurting so bad? How do you have what they called androica, which means calmness? How do you have peace of mind? And the Epicureans, they were called the philosophers of the garden. Their motto, if to use today's word, was just YOLO. Live once, have a lot of fun. They came up with ways that you can have as much possible fun without hurting yourself. There was a group before that called the hedonists, and they would get really drunk and then be really hungover. And the Epicureans would say, well, if you drink too much, you're not actually having fun because the next 2 days are miserable. So we learned how to drink just enough not to have a hangover. We learned how to mess around with women just enough so that we don't catch stuff and spread our kids around. And they would just try to walk that line of how much fun can we have, because we want to make the most out of life, but we don't want to hurt ourselves in the process. They had a whole school of philosophy around this. How to get better at success in business. They would teach lessons where you'd put stones in your mouth and learn how to give speeches so that you can go into people, and it didn't matter what you were selling, but you were the best spokesman in the room, and you get really rich. Kind of an early, 200 BC version of how to make friends and influence people. The Stoics, on the other hand, they believed that life was pain. And the way to get through this is to learn how to have a mindset that I will not be defeated. Life is fatalistic, but I'm going to keep going forward. And so they were all living in the same world where for the Epicureans, the gods were so far away, they didn't care about you anymore. For the Stoics, the world was close, God was close, and he didn't care about you. And this was the world, and the reason I tell you all this is why Paul said what he said. He went to that level of understanding so that he could bring Jesus to them. And so some of the weird stuff he said and what I read is him strategically understanding their questions and trying to answer them. I won't reread the whole thing, but Paul stands on Mars Hill and he says, I saw that you believe in an unknown God. And what you don't understand, I'm going to tell you. Then he says there was one God who made the whole world. That's where being existed. And at the very end of the discourse, he says, for in him we live and we move and we have our being. Even one of your own poets said, we are his offspring. You can almost hear Paul saying, you hear that, Thales? There is a unifying world. There is a unifying thing underneath everything. It's not water, it's God. And you hear that, Aristotle? God is a person. He exists, and he's not just this abstract, unmoved mover. He showed up in a burning bush. His name is Yahweh. He says, I am. All the things that you don't understand, but the questions you're asking, the Bible helps make sense. And I think today, if we can have that understanding to say there's big questions out there about science and the universe, but also personal questions like the Stoics and Epicureans had. How do I just not be so miserable? And the Bible is actually able to answer both levels. The Bible is not a book of science, but it can help you understand why science exists. You know that the biggest scientists were Christians? Because a lot of people believe that the world was chaos, and Christians believe that there is a God, and early scientists, if there is a God, then the universe is predictable because God holds it together. So now I can study, and I can learn, and I can try to make progress. And so these questions are still out there today. And one of the reasons sometimes that the church isn't reaching the world around us is we're yelling answers to questions they're not asking. People might not be asking, am I going to hell? We can talk about that, but that's not a question they're asking right now. What they are asking is, how do I get through this pandemic without losing my mind? Why am I even here? Now that I'm thinking about how bad the world is, why even live another day? That's the stuff I hear. And if we're not answering those questions, we're not actually helping. We're not giving them news that they can hear. And so the next thing Paul does is he found those points of agreement. The quote I just read, in him we live and move and have our being. In the Bible, it's got quotes in it. What part of the Bible is Paul quoting? It's not in the Bible. Those two quotes up there In him we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring. One is from a guy named Epimenides of Crete. The other one is Erastus, who is a 2nd century Stoic. And both those quotes were originally attributed to Zeus. And so Paul is grabbing pagan philosophy and saying, these are your quotes to your unknown God. Let me tell you who he is. So he'll grab their culture and accommodate it for Christianity and say the things that you're already saying, the things you're already thinking are about Jesus. And to me, when I first read that, that was scandalous. You can't quote a pagan and make it about Jesus. It was about Zeus. You got to talk about Zeus if you use that. But what Paul says, he said a true thing, and the thing that you didn't know, I'm going to proclaim to you. Your unknown God, all the questions you had, I'm going to help you understand what it's about. And that's bold. And it gives us so much permission and accountability to say, when we engage in culture, we need to make everything make sense about Jesus. That's where Paul said elsewhere in the Bible, I'm going to take every thought captive to make it subservient to Jesus. So whatever I read, whatever I look at, I'm going to try to see where is Jesus in this. If you don't believe me, there's this old guy named John Calvin who wrote a thing about general revelation. And he says that all truth is from God. The summary of this is all truth is God's truth, but he says all truth is of God. And consequently, if wicked men have said something that is true and just, we ought not to reject it, for even that has come from God. So you can read a Stoic philosopher, and you can learn something. All truth is God's truth. And so this gives us permission to begin engaging culture. And this is what it says in Psalm 19, what I said earlier in the call to worship. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the works of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they pour forth knowledge. We live in a universe that makes sense. And there's special revelation. We have the Bible, but there's general revelation. Just everybody somewhere has a sense that there is a God. It's in the universe. It's built into the image of God in us. That's why you talk to anybody from any culture, and they have big questions they don't know how to answer. And so once we get those, we find points of agreement. That's what Paul was doing with those quotes. Is he says, these are our points of agreement. These are the things that you're already saying. And honestly, this is why I use pop culture references. I mentioned movies that Rick has never heard of before, or TV shows. The reason I do this, honestly, is to try to be biblical. If Paul can quote Greek philosophers to make the gospel make sense, my goal is to quote things that we'll understand so that you can understand the gospel. My very first sermon, I was back in South Holland, and I was preaching about Ecclesiastes. And this was mid-90s. Everything was grunge. And so, not my text, I was reading from Ecclesiastes where it says, life is meaningless. The only thing that makes sense is to obey God and worship him. And so how am I going to help people my age in 1996, I believe, understand that? So I quoted the great songwriter Eddie Vedder and his song Indifference, where Eddie Vedder writes, I will hold the candle till it burns my arm. I'll take the punches until their arms grow tired. I'll stare the sun down until I go blind. I won't change my direction, but how much difference does that make? And then the Red Hot Chili Peppers, sometimes I feel like I don't have a partner. Sometimes I feel like I'm all alone. And if that's the question you're asking, and we have this point of overlap where the non-Christian world at the time and the book of Ecclesiastes are all asking the same questions, that's our point of agreement. I've been listening. I know your questions. I see where you're coming from. I'm not saying your questions are bad questions. I'm saying your questions are my questions too. But the answer's here. It's in the Bible. It's in Jesus. And so that's why we take those questions on. That's why we can look at what's out there right now, where people right now are asking, how do we find peace between races and classes? And we can say it makes a lot more sense in the Bible than in anything else you're going to find out there by Ibram X. Kendi. How does the truth intersect with politics and the media? And we have to realize that if there actually is a truth, it's not all propaganda. So what do we actually say? Is there a cultural norm and actually absolute truths when it comes to gender and sexuality? Or maybe even more personal, how do I just manage my anxiety? These are the questions out there, and we can grab the questions they're asking in art and film and media and discourse, podcasts, and bring that in and say, this is what the gospel is. It's Jesus giving us hope in the middle of anxiety. It's God saying, don't be anxious because I can control this. You can't change anything. So don't worry so much. And begin to give people peace of mind. Part of this, as we do it, we're going to uncover the gaps in their worldview. That's the third thing. Is Paul says, you have all these gaps. You're talking about an unknown God. And what he says when he talks about how God created everything, it says in verse 28, he says, God did this. He made the world in an orderly, manageable, beautiful way so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. And that phrase, reach out and find, he's actually stealing a little scene from the Odyssey. You guys ever see or read the Odyssey with Homer? Or Homer wrote it. Odysseus is coming back from the Iliad. Long story, great stuff. But he's captured by a cyclops. And the cyclops has all these sheep. And every day he would let the sheep in, let the sheep out. And so Odysseus blinds the cyclops. Cyclops just has one eye. And then they all tie themselves to the belly of the sheep. So when the cyclops lets his giant sheep out, they all get to escape. And the phrase is that the cyclops is seeking to find them. And he's feeling the tops of all the sheep and kind of patting them down and can't find these heroes. And Paul uses that phrase to say, that's what you guys are like. You're like a blind cyclops looking for the truth. You're padding around out there. And Epicureans, you think God's so far away that you'll never reach him. But you're so close. Life is to be enjoyed. But you're so far away because God's so close to you and there's better joy than in alcohol and in sex. You were this close, but you were wrong. Here's the answer. You were reaching, you were grabbing for it. And here's the truth. Stoics, life is painful. There is suffering. But God actually cares about you. It's not this world machine trying to grind you down. You've been reaching. You were so close. And we can say the same thing in our world. The picture up there of a celebrity named Zac Efron. And I read an interview from him from 2014. And he had just gotten out of rehab. And what he says in the interview is, I'd done films back to back. He was in, summer camp or all this Disney singing stuff. Never saw it. But I'd done films back to back and I was burned out. There was something lacking, some sort of hole I just couldn't really fill up. It was just so deep into my work. It was the only thing I really had. You're 20, you're single, you're going through Hollywood. And you'd think, that's all of our cultural idols. He's good looking, he's rich, he's successful, he's everywhere. And he's empty. His idols didn't fill him up. And so he tried to fill it with other things. Now he's got his life together, he seems to be doing really well. But back then in his 20s, he bottomed out even though he had everything. There's another guy named Marcus Peterson. He invented a game called Minecraft, which if you've ever played it, it's pretty much digital Legos. And he sold his company in his 20s for $2.5 billion with a B dollars. He bought a $70 million mansion and was empty. He writes, the problem with getting everything is you run out of reasons to keep trying. I hung out with a bunch of friends, partying with famous people, able to do whatever I wanted, and have never felt more isolated. Do you see the gaps in their worldview? And that's what we try to do, is not just point out gaps. Sometimes when Christians point out things that are wrong, it's not to be mean and say, you're wrong, we're right. Say, look, you're just hurting yourself. That's not going to fill you. Maybe I've tried it, maybe I know people who have, but that's not going to actually help. Could I help you? Sometimes we just have to ask a lot of questions of people and say, are the things you're thinking actually coherent? And then once we do that, the last thing is to share the good news. We step in and we say, this is what God wrote. And I won't read the whole thing that's up there. But what Paul pretty much does is gives them bad news and good news. He says, in the past, God overlooked your ignorance. You were groping, you were finding, and God gave you time. But now he commands that people everywhere repent. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice. By the man he appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So the good news begins with bad news. The bad news is your idols didn't fill you. You didn't live up to your own standards. But the good news is that Jesus died for you. And that can begin to answer everything. And the responses to that are some sneered, some said, can we keep hearing you? And others became followers, including it calls out a guy named Dionysius, who's actually named after the god of partying. And he says, maybe my whole life has been dedicated to this God, and now I'm going to follow yours. And that's what we're called to do. As we conclude, I just want to tell you the story about a lady named Jordan Mung. She was a skeptic as early as she can remember. Even at age 4, she remembers arguing with people about whether the Bible is true. So she was not raised in a Christian home. But in the year 2008, she set off for Harvard University. And their motto is Veritas, which means truth. And she wanted to find truth. And she never could have expected, she writes, what found her there. She met a guy named John Joseph Porter, and they began to have debates about Christianity. He wrote articles in Ichthus, which was Harvard's Christian journal, and she would critique them for the atheist side. They would have all these conversations. But she writes, never before had I met a Christian who could respond to my most basic philosophical questions. How does one become the Bible? How does one understand the Bible's contradictions? Can an all-powerful God make a rock he couldn't lift? How are some things good? Does God actually make what's good, or does he just say what's good? And he couldn't just say the word, it just takes faith, because that seemed like a cop-out to me, and he never did. And he also did something else, she writes. He pointed out to me how inconsistent I was as an atheist who nevertheless believed in right and wrong. I believed in good and bad and universal categories. So defenseless, I took an ethics class. After all, atheists had been delivering ethical systems for 200 years, so I figured I could understand it. And she was assigned a paper by C.S. Lewis, who answered all her philosophical questions with the answers about God. She was also pushed to look at the big questions of life. She'd also believed in the Big Bang Theory, but was unaware that the man who first proposed it, George Lemaitre, was a Catholic priest. And she'd always happily avoided that rabbit trail Carl Sagan would avoid about the problem of what caused the Big Bang and what caused that cause and so on. By Valentine's Day, I began to believe in God. And by Easter, I dedicated my life to Christ. And she says, I came to Harvard looking for Veritas, but the truth found me. And her article is longer. I can put it on the church's website. But I love that story because what happened to her is exactly what Paul was doing on Mars Hill and exactly what God calls us to do. It's always love. It's never, you're wrong, I'm going to get in your face, I'm going to prove to you how foolish you are. It's just, no, here's a question, here's an answer. Have you considered this question? May I ask you another question? If you turn on people's brains, I believe it'll lead them back to Christ. And in love, God pursues people. And in her story, she writes how at first she thought of the cross as just this bloody, terrible thing. But then she began to see it as loving beauty, and then she began to realize that she didn't even uphold her own moral standards. And it became more than just a beautiful thing. It became the ultimate act of love. So it was not just an academic change. It was, I realized I needed it not just to be true out there. I'm so glad it's true for me. And so today, I want you to ask if you've ever actually said that about yourself. That Christianity is true, not just objectively true out there, but it's also true for me. I need this to be true. And actually, if it is, then who else can you be praying for? Who else can you step into a conversation with? You're never going to do it perfectly. Even Paul got sneered at. But who can you tell about Jesus? Ask those questions, understand them, and lovingly share the gospel. So let me close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you would pursue people like Jordan, the story we just heard. That you actually pursued Paul. You pursued me. You pursued all of us in this room, Lord. You are pursuing us right now. And so, Father, I pray that your presence would be here to take what we've been talking about and anchor it into our hearts. That we need you. That you were answering questions that we've been asking for thousands of years, that the truth is found in you. And so, Father, help us to not be empty inside like we've heard these stories, but to be filled with your love and your grace. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. For our closing song, we're going to sing. I love to tell the story, so let's stand together as we sing.